there's an issue of institutional memory, right? So going back to the tech angle, even if a state implements a great tech product, right? Let's say on accounting or on some procurement, etc., through a vendor, it often doesn't get institutionalized outside of the life cycle of the RFP.
Hello and welcome to the season 2 of Understanding the Future. I am your host Punit Gandhi, and Climate Center for Cities is excited to bring to you a podcast about the future of work in the field of climate change, urban development, sustainability, and innovation. We will talk to experts working on ground as well as in the top management of government and non-governmental organizations to better understand how the field looks like in future. This will help us in preparing to enable climate actions as well as gauge the type of skill sets and jobs that would be required in future to solve complex challenges. If you are listening to it for the first time, do tune into season 1. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the season 2 of Understanding the Future. I am your host, Punit Gandhi, and the first time we have two guests with us on our podcast. We have Vivek Anandan Nair, Head of ASICS and Partnerships at Janaagraha Centre for Citizenship and Democracy. And another guest we have with us is Vachana, Associate Manager for Advocacy at Janaagraha Centre for Citizenship and Democracy. Welcome to the show, Vivek and Vachana.
Glad to be here, Puneet.
So before we start with complexity of city systems, let's try and focus on what is the kind of where this impacts, and that is citizens. And we talk about quality of life. So are we looking at any benchmarks in case of quality of life that our citizens should have? That we do this kind of we understand the complexity of the city systems.
Yeah, let me try and have a crack at that. And in fact, it's interesting that you're starting with the quality of life of citizens. So you might have noticed I would like to call it a nuance, but let me put it this way, the strangeness in the title of my designation, which is Head ASICS and Partnerships. Now, partnerships is something that pretty much everybody gets. But what is ASICS, right? That's an abbreviation for the Annual Survey of India's City Systems. It's one of the flagship knowledge products on urban governance systems in India. I'm putting it in air quotes and calling it urban governance, and there's a reason why. Let me explain that. It has deep linkages with what you just asked us right now, right? There are benchmarks for quality of life, and those benchmarks have existed for a very long time, right? And some people define these benchmarks as, let's say, the service levels that we see in cities, be it the quality of water that you get, the amount of time you get that, be it electricity, be it roads, footpaths, air pollution, and a bunch of other indicators, right? And from time to time, we've always had multiple efforts trying to first benchmark it, and more often than not, it's been essentially which is the best. You go out, you look at a large set, and you figure out, hey, here's a city in another country or within India that looks brilliant, so let's measure everything against it. Or there are several other ways in which people do it, and then reports come out. I mean, you will, I'm sure, be also aware of the recent effort done by the government of India itself, which is the Ease of Living Index. And if you look at pretty much every other human resource based consulting organization, they have their own, because a lot of the salary benchmark comes from the quality of life in these cities, right? So all of these have been done, and there are. I wouldn't comment on the benchmark. So Vachana, you can jump in and talk about what the benchmark of a good life should be. But I'll talk about ASICS and why is it that Janaagraha tries to look at what we call city systems. So our hypothesis has been that whatever quality of life aspirations a city has, right? Be it the fact that we want 100% public transportation, or let's say that's a mobility outcome that somebody articulates. Now, naturally, that is something that comes from the political economy, which is pushed by the people, and then the administrative system sort of implements that and makes it happen. Now, in this whole piece, while people articulate the end of the rainbow sort of metric, which is we want better public transportation, we want better parks, what we've always felt is missing in the narrative is how do you even get to the end of the rainbow? Right. So there's a big, if you look at it as an iceberg, and this is something that is a go-to for Janaagraha. Let me go to it once again, which is what is visible on top, right? Is the quality of life that we experience as citizens. Leave alone benchmark. Everybody has their own. Somebody who goes to probably is used to visiting Europe a lot, aspires to some, let's say, Nordic countries for quality of life. Some others would look at a Paris. Somebody looks at a US. So I'm not looking at the benchmarks for now. But what we see and experience is above the iceberg. What holds it up, holds it afloat, is what we in Janaagraha call city systems. These are the underlying and for most citizens invisible, almost invisible processes that allow for these quality of life aspirations to be delivered. Now, what does that mean? That simply means what are the laws, what are the policies, what are the institutions and institutional frameworks, what are the transparency and accountability mechanisms, and how well are citizens participating in all of this, right? Together, these systems are what help any government deliver on sectoral quality of life aspirations, which is what we started doing somewhere, I think, in 2013. Correct me if I'm wrong. So, like I said, long answer to your short question on the benchmark itself, but from Janagra's side, this may sound interesting, but we've rarely looked at across the board benchmarks of what quality of life should be. We've looked at benchmark of how governance system should be,
Okay.
which should allow for whatever quality of life aspirations that particular city has, right? For instance, the quality of life aspirations for somebody living in a Bengaluru is going to be in some ways drastically different from somebody who's living in a Lucknow, or somebody who's living in, let's say, a municipality called Jatani, which is in Odisha. Vastly different. Some things may overlap, like everybody needs clean air, clean water, but apart from the basics, a lot of things overlap, right? So, like I said, from Janagra's perspective, I wouldn't want to comment so much on the quality of life benchmarking per se, but focus more on how do we get there? Do we have the systems and processes in place that'll help us get there in the first place? Otherwise, I keep sometimes drawing this analogy. The best intentions into the existing way we work is similar to throwing water, not throwing, putting water in a leaky bucket, because your system is not in place. Your ability to deliver on those quality of life benchmarks, so to say, are quite restricted. Yeah. So I'm saying I'm going to stop with that. Let's see if Vachana has a different take on it.
No, no, I actually agree with Vivek, and I would like to reiterate that point. So, the benchmark, I mean, looking at the benchmark would be actually relative from person to person, from city to city. But what that runs across all of these verticals, the sectors essentially, is how the governance systems and mechanisms in place. So, I would just take a little bit time to detail that, the framework that we look at, the same city systems lens that Vivek just mentioned. So what in the city systems framework that Janagraha has come up with has four components. There is one component of urban planning and design, where we essentially look at whether how cities implement and enforce these plans, and what is the citizen participation element in planning and designing for the city. Second is with regards to the capacities of the cities. This is in terms of three respects: financial, human resources, and usage of information technology for process efficiency. Third is about how empowered are our city political leaders, right? The mayors and the councils. And fourth is pretty much straightforward. It is citizen participation, transparency, and accountability. So these four components need to essentially come together for a city to deliver good quality of life. So unless this is fixed and sorted, it's almost impossible. It's impossible for the city to deliver a good quality of life. So these nuts and bolts essentially need to be fixed.
No, absolutely, I agree. Like these are some major components, and when we look at it, they look as general as possible. But that is where we also need to focus on that. How can this generalized things be as specialized in their own niches? And but one thing that has happened is I've started working in urban development for almost 2 years now. I never knew about urban development. I do not belong to that field from academic point of view as well. But in 2 years, one thing I've understood is it is complex. Everything is interrelated. Each thing affects the other thing. But I have never been able to define it, how everything is so complex, so interconnected, and so together, but everything is still in silos. So, how would you define urban complexity if I have to ask you that?
I don't know where to call it $1 million question, but let me put it this way: urban complexity. The definition there are lots of funny things in the way we see urban today, which I think will help answer the question itself. So let me start by giving a few anecdotes. Maybe that will make it a little interesting. For let's start with something that's in the Constitution, right? The 74th Amendment, which sort of brought to life a vast number of what today are popularly referred to as urban local bodies. In pretty much every other government document, that's what it's called. But the fact is that nowhere in the Constitution does it say urban local bodies. So I'm saying that's complexity number one. It is urban local self government, which today is popularly referred to as urban local bodies. So there is complexity that arises out of how it was envisioned and how it is being administered. So from the imagination of a government of a place, it has now become in I mean, if you go outside some of the big centers, it is almost like an execution arm of the state government, and in a lot of ways, the central government, right? Because you haven't realized the vision of a true governance at that government at that place. It's a body. That's saying that I just wanted to put this out there as a starting off point, right? So there is complexity that arises because of how it's envisioned and answers. Now, the second layer of complexity is this, that when we often say urban, and this is a slightly more technical one, but I wanted to touch upon this in the irrespective. There are plenty of people who work on what is urban, right? There is a definition that we have, which is a statutory thing that every state is allowed to choose which is an urban center, which is not. Then there is something that the census does. Then there is a vast amount of research which actually tries to define what is urban in the first place, right? Apart from the state definitions of 25%, no, 75% main working families, etc., and the density, there are, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Vachana, there are reports from IDFC Institute which were talking about the fact that India could be as much as 65% urban already, right? So and that's because if you start looking at the economy in nuts and bolts, you'll start to see that a lot of people have already shifted out of work lines that are directly linked by agriculture, right? And then there are other examples, some of which we've quoted in our own works extensively, which is if you take, for instance, Mexico's definition of what urban is and apply it to places in India. I think places like Kerala. Kerala, correct me if I'm wrong, Vachana could be as much as 95% urban already by some definitions of urban that float
Yes.
around,
Yes,
right?
that's right.
So I'm saying there is another layer of complexity which comes from what is urban, what is not urban, and directly linked with that is this big challenge which adds, I think it's one of the biggest reasons for this complexity, is that urban is a space, it's an area, but it is defined and governed as a bunch of silos. So the governance of a space, for instance, the space that you call out right now is an urban local body. It has to have its own government, but within that space that supposedly has its own government, there is the central government's arm that is trying to operate some parts of quality of life for people. There is the state government that is operating multiple through either its own departments or what is known as parastatal, which is largely state-owned entities. Then there is bits and pieces of the urban local body or urban local self-government itself. So there are multiple, let's say, all three layers of government acting within that same space, using their own independent protocols, independent laws, policies, with rarely any way of being able to coordinate action in a manner that synergizes efforts, money, time, etc. And like I said, this third piece is where the biggest amount of complexity stems from. I'm not even going to the political side of it, which also comes from the fact that the delimitation has been done in a way that the representation in the Parliament of India, in state legislatures, is not, it's pretty much not mirroring how many people live in urban centers in India today. So the voice of the urban people in democracy is a little bit stifled, and which also shows up in the way we make somewhat lopsided policies that don't favor urban as much as they favor rural, right? We're still, I think, tending a little towards India lives in its villages story, which I think has changed significantly since this statement first came out, right? So these are all reasons why it's incredibly complicated today, this space called urban. And I think I also tried to answer your question in a way by saying that it's next to impossible for anybody to define urban. It's only possible for you to read the multiple layers and figure out which entity you're working with,
Yeah.
whether to solve a problem or to define a problem, and then try and see it from their particular lens and their worldview, and in some ways overlap all these other views to say that, okay, if this is how you're trying to fix urban or to figure out what is wrong in urban, let me apply your lens, then let me come in with other angles, the ones that I called out, and see, how those angles add to either the problems in the diagnosis or for the solutions. So I mean, that's one way I would suggest it, as opposed to the easy. I mean, there is no easy way to do it, let's be honest.
I absolutely agree with it. And Vacha, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I actually agree with Vivek. I have nothing much to add, just to say that. So, I mean, what often is a constraint in how, urban governance essentially work is also that absence of a place-based approach, right?
Yeah.
Like what essentially Vivek indicated is the severe fragmentation of governance that happens. So when we see urban local body as an administration unit, there are several other bodies, avenues of spending that happens in a city. Now, for example, if we take Bangalore, so there is a central government schemes, central government bodies like National Highway Authority of India, etc., coming into picture. There are state government departments, there are city civic agencies, and all of them spend, say, for a city of Bangalore. And Bangalore could be any other city as well, right? And we are unable to track what is the total expenditure on infrastructure for a city. We are unable to track what is the utilization of assets on a city. And when these two pictures are unavailable, we are unable to
We
even
don't know the
estimate.
GDP of a city,
Yes, yeah,
which
exactly.
is
So
what
city is not,
runs the country and the
yes,
world.
yes. So city in India is not identified as an economic unit at all. And that's a big problem, right?
Yeah.
And anyways, at the end of the day, wherever we are, cities are perhaps one of the most complex systems that has been created by human beings, right? So it is indeed complex. It is indeed complex, and it's very difficult to understand, layer it out, etc. So yeah, I mean
Yeah,
that's
and
one.
in a lighter vein, just to say, people have spent their entire PhDs just trying to define what urban is. So to be able to answer it on a podcast is I guess reaching a little bit too much, I guess.
Yeah, thank you. I think that was still quite comprehensive enough for at least people to know who do not know much about this. And coming to points that both of you raised, one is about tracking of different activities, and another is of silos. I think a lot of things are being pushed on those lines for digitization, because for digitization point of view, when citizen looks at any service, there is multiple silos that have been breached, that okay, this, there is a process that comes into place, that this document has gone from this department to this department, and then this department, and eventually it is coming back to you. So digitization is one way. I do believe silos can be broken down, but not always. Any thoughts on that? Any other ways do you think we can help break these silos as well as track those things, because this also helps us in tracking things in a better way, analyzing things in a better way, and making it go forward.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good question. I am a firm believer of the fact that injecting a healthy amount of technology into whatever it is that we are doing, however it is that we are doing, has the potential to drastically change outcomes for the better, right? And this is I'm making a very broad statement. This applies to all levels of government, urban, rural, wherever you think of it, it comes there. And at the same time, also recognize that technology is a tool,
Yeah.
right? And for the tool to be effective, you have to consider what it takes for the ecosystem which operates around the tool to be able to grasp the tool and use the
Yeah.
tool for its intended reasons, right? So India, for I'm saying, let me not say India, across several states over the last few years, that at least I've been very heavily invested in the urban development story. I've seen governments taking big leaps of faith in trying to inject a heavy amount of technology based processes to get
Yeah.
things working, right? And there are several successful stories, and there are perhaps a larger number of things that don't work out,
Yeah.
right? And let me quote one example, which happens in state after state, right? State after state invests in what can be loosely defined as an ERP system for the state,
Yeah.
an enterprise resource planning system. While it's not really a resource planning system, at least what they're trying to do is digitize a bunch of things. For instance, a citizen has to fill up a form, it goes somewhere, it happens automatically. And then, there is limited face time that has to be done. And it's been deployed, let's say, across the state at scale. Now, a lot of these times, there are other issues that crop up because of what I said, right? When you look at the tool as a blunt instrument without recognizing that for it to fit into the system, you need a bunch of ecosystem changes. And what are those ecosystem changes? At the heart of it is the people, and how you get those people to use these systems.
Yeah.
Recognize the challenges. For instance, recognize the challenges of somebody who was hired, let's say, in an NULM, similar to an NULM scheme in the let's say late 1990s, 1998 or 2000, into a government somewhere, let's say in Odisha. They were
Yeah.
hired when they were 22 years old. They are still in the system because schemes like NULM continue.
Yeah.
They were never trained on anything. They were never told what else to do. But at that time, they were hired as an, let's say, a computer operator because it was pretty new. Since
Yeah.
since then, they've been trying to get a hang of whatever is thrown at them. But now, if you inject technology and get that person who's sitting at some small, ULB, which is, let's say, the tiniest sort, with a population of, let's say, I don't know, 50, 650, 60,000 people. It's not a large town.
Yeah.
How do you get that person to be able to interact efficiently with the piece of technology that you have there?
Yeah.
Are they capable of doing it? Are they not capable of doing it? So what I think I've seen progressively happen over time is that the chasm between what our big cities can do and what our small cities can do by injecting a healthy level of technology is only widening.
Yeah.
Because in Bangalore, if you have a great command and control system, Bangalore has the ability to crowd in the sort of talent that is needed even within government,
Yeah.
be it through body shopping from the likes of human resource agencies or the big fours for the governments that have money. They are able to somehow use that technology as a brilliant tool.
Yeah.
But look at the number of cities, right? What is the latest number? Vachana? It's about 4,800, 4,900,
It's 4,372.
4372.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's 4372. I think out of this, it's safe to assume that barring the 500 Amrut cities,
Yeah.
it's quite difficult to imagine, technology playing a very big role unless you focus on the people part. Again, having said that, it doesn't mean that technology is not the way to go. The
Yeah.
point that I guess I'm trying to make is that technology is brilliant, but there has often been an ignorance of the people aspect plus the other policy aspect. For instance, if you are trying to now introduce a digital way of, let's say, collecting money,
Yeah.
are you tweaking the law that was framed in 1956, let's say the Municipal Act of some state,
Yeah.
which says that you can use a register? Because then you are giving two options, right? You're giving somebody who's used to collecting on pen and paper. I'm giving an example of
Yeah.
particularly
Yeah.
of, let's say, some revenue collection. You're giving an option to that, let's say, 55-year-old gentleman or lady to use whatever they are best used to
Yeah.
in that small city. And they've been doing it since time immemorial because the law has that written. Now all of a sudden you have a digital system. If you don't use it, big deal. You are at least adhering to the law. So are we doing the ecosystem changes, law, policy, people, etc., to make it happen? Is something I think that is which is super critical to bringing in technology. Not to say that you shouldn't, you should
Yeah.
continue to, but there is a need to focus very heavily on what more does digitization take? And digitization is a big word, right? I would say
Yeah.
there is one part is technology, one part is people, and there is a whole part of outside of this law and policy of change management,
Yeah.
which is how do you make sure that every touch point of interaction, be it citizens, be it within the government, each client, how are you managing these people, or their knowledge, attitude, behavior change to be able to work this system efficiently, which is now heavily driven by automation and tech. That's one thing that I've seen has been missing for a while, but I'm not sure that's been missing for want of intent. I think it again boils down to something that we keep calling out in ASICS, right? That our cities, in more often than not, even our state governments run on steam. While people may think that we have a lot of government, we barely have any
We
government,
barely. Yeah.
right? We
That's.
barely have. Our cities are incredibly understaffed, and in some ways, I'm surprised they're running as well as they are,
Yeah.
with 30, 40, 50% vacancies. So I'll stop with that. long monologue, and please do jump in.
Yeah, so I think there is one problem of contextualizing digitization, of course, because there is definitely even in smart cities, for example, in our interactions, we often hear that some of the cities are unable to actually get the right kind of professional service at all. There is no interest, and even if someone joins, it's so difficult to retain them.
Yeah.
At when we as we say that, it's quite interesting that when a city like Bangalore, which is like the Silicon Valley of India, when it amended its when it in fact overhauled its act, so in 20 with the new BBMP Act 2020, there is not even a single provision to use technology in governance, which I mean which is really sad, right? I mean, if Bangalore cannot use it, if Bangalore couldn't bring out that change, then that's also a problem. So I'm just saying that we need to be cognizant of both of these realities. Yeah.
Yeah. And coming to the point that you specifically mentioned about capacities, yes, it's absolutely low. And every time you see people checking, like, "Arey, there is always this line, and always I have to wait for any government thing I have to do." But no one understands what is the capacity gap, and then the amount of changes that keeps on coming in the ecosystem, especially any big city or medium size scale city. If I'm taking, if they are shifting to digitization, then there is a capacity issue as well on lines of they don't know how to do it. So while there is 30 to 40% vacancy rates, there is also more than that the amount of learnings that they don't have.
Yes.
And that is where I feel something needs to happen. And any thoughts on those lines, how that
Yeah, no,
can.
it's brilliant that you picked that up, and that's, like I said, often it's the conversation on people is missing in a lot of, how to say this, in a lot of discussions around how to fix urban. Let me put it that way.
Yeah,
I think the conversation on people and what you just called out is, I feel personally, is quite missing, and I think the reason for that is it's too complicated a challenge, I think, that most people feel that they can solve. And let me put it in the, how to say, overlay it with the timeline of the key actors who are able to do this, right? There
yeah,
is the political executive,
yeah,
and there's a 5-year shelf life.
yeah,
Then there's the bureaucratic, let's say, reform agent. I'm
yeah,
calling the bureaucratic reform agent because not everybody in bureaucracy wants to reform systems. I mean, some choose to firefight because that's the order of the day. Some choose to do a little bit of systems and mostly delivery of services and goods. Fair enough. There are very few people who are systems reform agents within the bureaucratic circles. Let me put it that way. And their lifespan is between 1 to 2 to 3 years, right? How many
yeah,
bureaucrats can you name who stayed in a department for 7, 8, 9 years?
yeah,
And the sort of time that we need to transform this the people issue and the capacities and the business process reengineering issue at scale is in the order of tens of years. So it might take 10 years, it might take 20 years. Like Janaagraha has been around for what now? 2 decades.
yeah,
It's taken constant pushing for us to sort of get to a place where now in India we are looking at least having audited accounts come out of India cities, some of which are size of some of the world's largest companies. They still are not able to get out third-party audited accounts, right? So this
yeah,
takes time, and so I'm just putting in the timeline concept. What is realistic to imagine? But the problem on capacities, I largely see are fourfold. One is number. You don't have the
yeah,
right number of people. Second is kind. You don't have the right kind of people for a particular post or for a particular problem to be solved. What is the sort of expertise that you need? Are you able to acquire those? And the ecosystem, which is, do you have the public service commission? Do you have lateral hiring? All of that. The third system, the third issue within staffing is, do you have adequate performance management
yeah,
systems, which is how do you hold each of your employees accountable to whatever task it is that's been assigned to them
yeah,
by whichever layer, be it the administrative layer, be it the political economy. And then the fourth is, how's the org structure?
yeah,
Is your org structure tuned to deliver in an efficient, agile manner? Given that cities are incredibly complicated, you need to have a structure that is able to respond like this,
yeah,
right? Because something can go wrong here, and some 10-year project continues needs to happen all the time. Therefore, are you tuned to that? So these four problems exist, because of which there is incredible there's an issue of institutional memory, right? So Going back to the tech angle, even if a state implements a great tech product, right? Let's say on accounting or on some procurement, etc., through a vendor, it often doesn't get institutionalized outside of the life cycle of the RFP.
Yeah.
Let's say you have a 5-year agreement to say we will implement this system, and some KPMG comes and does it. Great. Now, but the state does not have institutional memory to be able to learn from that and do a plus plus on their own the next time. So they're locked into this cycle of getting external support and doing it, which I mean, to be honest, that's not the worst thing to happen. But in the process, it's very difficult for them to build institutional memory at scale. That's something that I think is missing, and that's, like I said, it's a long challenge, right from the second ARC report in 2006, maybe even 15-20 years ago. This has been highlighted by several people, but that it remains to be something that we are solving. The one thing I'd like to point out is there are glimpses of hope, because a lot of people have started saying that this is the bottleneck. So if Puneet is the commissioner of a city, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter that, let's say, the CM of the state has a grand vision to make the city the best place, because if Puneet is not able to do his job, or if Vivek is the commissioner, or let's say the engineer who is not able to do a good RFP,
Yeah.
then your project gets stuck for 2 years in some litigation some days, because contract management is not happening. So there is recognition of this, and there are small steps that people are taking. If you look at the 15th Finance Commission report that just came out, there is mention of something called a municipal shared services and a data center, for which I think the 15th FC has parked some money. That
Yeah.
is their effort to sort of encourage states to figure out how to solve the staffing issue
Yeah.
via media. Obviously, you can't get around the fact that you need this big change. But what is the via media? There are some encouraging signs happening in India around that. So
Vachana, any thoughts you have on this?
No, I think Vivek has covered it well, nothing to add.
Thank you for listening to part one of this episode. Next week, we'll come up with the part two and continue our conversations. Here's a sneak peek for the same. If government can't do it, who else? Like, people always think that government coffers are always full, and we have enough money, and we have everything that can be done is possible. If you don't have resources, who has? You have been listening to Understanding the Future podcast. To know more about Climate Center for Cities, check out our website www.niua.org/c-q. The show is conceptualized, produced, and edited by Punit Gandhi, Senior Associate at CQ. You can now subscribe to our podcast on your favorite channel, which can be accessed through the credits. Also, don't forget to follow us on our social media for more updates. Do share your reviews with us and help us spread the podcast to your friends and colleagues. Do write to us if you would be interested in learning about any specific topics. Thank you, and stay tuned for our next episode.